So we're here on Mount Gilboa, and we're overlooking the valley of Harod. Okay, this is named after a spring which is mentioned in the book of Judges, related to the story of Gideon. And when we look back at that story in chapter 6 of the book of Judges, we see that the enemies of Israel, the Midianites and the Amalekites, were encamped in what they call the Jezreel Valley. Now, most likely in the Bible, they're connecting three valleys. We call them just the valleys normally, all together. So they probably intended for part of this to be considered the Jezreel Valley. Now, the modern name is the Harod Valley, but we call it all just the valleys in general. So Gideon came from that direction over the mountain cliffs, and he got to this area and looked out at this vast valley that stretches east to west all the way from the Sea of Galilee, or the Jordan River area, all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. And according to the Bible, it was filled like locusts with the Midianites. And we have, if we look now, we can see it's a very fertile valley, and it's a valley full of produce, the breadbasket of the country in many regards. And the Israelites at the time were concerned about their food. We hear the story of Gideon threshing his wheat in a wine press in order to hide it from the Midianites. Now, who were the Midianites? Why were they here? So we're going to go more deeply into the story of Gideon in the book of Judges, chapter 6 and 7, as we look at the landscape and how that affected the outcome and the issues that were the people of Israel were struggling with in the book of Judges during the time of the judge Gideon. So to give you an idea of where we are and what we're looking at, we can see the Mediterranean Sea is here, and the Jordan River, the Dead Sea, Jordan River comes up this way, and the Sea of Galilee is here. And we see something called Givat Hamoreh. This is the hill of the teacher, right here. This is where the Midianites encamped when Gideon brought his army down. And Gideon came in this direction and camped on the Gilboa Mountains at first, and then went down to a spring, which we're going to go to next. So you can see from this view, this is a much higher mountain. He has a perfect view to see what his enemy forces are looking at. And also you can see the Jezreel Valley through here connects through different passes all the way to the sea. But you can see it's a very large valley, the Jezreel Valley, and it's full of grain. And the Midianites themselves were actually what we would call, in modern terminology, we would call them Bedouins. They were a mixture of Bedouin tribes. And there's always been this battle between the Bedouin culture and the farming culture, because Bedouins come with lots and lots of livestock. And when the desert becomes uninhabitable, they force their way north, and they usually attack the farmers because farmers have fields with lots of food for their livestock. And in general, if you look at Bedouin culture today and make a sort of assumption that things haven't changed a whole lot over the course of the centuries or millennia, then it might be that the battles between farmers and herders, or nomadic sheep herders and goat herders and camel herders, has been going on for a very, very long time. In Bedouin culture today, they despise farmers, probably because there's been this ancient battle going back and forth between those who have the herds and those who raise the crops. And during the time of Gideon, those nomadic tribesmen and all of their herds were so powerful that they drove not just from the Negev, where we would expect them to be. They drove all the way north and occupied the Jezreel Valley, the breadbasket of this entire area. And as a result, there was an occupation of the land by the Midianites. And the Israelites, who generally live on the mountains, but they farm in the fields, if that makes sense. They live in the mountains, but they farm on the fields. They had to live and farm on the mountains just to survive. So looking at a larger map to give you a better impression of where we are and the two people that we're talking about the Midianites who generally dwelled down in this area in the Negev. They came up somehow, either through the Jordan River or even maybe along the coast, and they took over this entire region right here, which means they controlled all of the area. Now, if you can zoom in on the map here, you can see the mountains here. These are what we call in Hebrew now, we call it Judea and Samaria. This is the traditional homeland of the Jewish people. We inhabited these mountains. And we often had conflict with the Philistines down in this area, and we had conflict with some others in different parts of the Canaanites that maybe held out different cities. But to see that the Midianites from the Negev, all the way down in the desert, came over and overtook most of the land, forcing the Israelites to flee only to the mountains, shows us part of the geographical conflict that was going on as well. So now we're going to look at some more modern maps so that you understand the geography that we're talking about here. So this is the modern land of Israel as it stands today. This map was created in 1937 by the Peel Commission. You can see it written here on the top of the map. And what they were promising the Jewish people, this was a division of the land between the local Arab population and the Jewish population in 1937. They said, how about we give the Jewish people this section, the blue, and we'll leave the green for the Arab population and create a sort of international zone, including Jerusalem, with an exit to the sea that will be for the international community, but under British control. This map was designed by the British. And now we look at a map that came about 10 years later, 1947. This was part of the United Nations partition plan. Again, they're still giving this area to the Jewish people. The green would be the Arab population. At that point, they realized that most of the Jewish population, most of the Negev, for example, where the Midianites were, was occupied primarily by the Jewish population. So they were trying to divide it based upon where population centers were. Now, what I want to point out is in any of these maps, we see this key city in Hebrew called Shechem, and this is now modern-day Nablus, and Gideon came from the area right here. So what would be now a majority of an Arab population area, this is where Gideon came from. And he traveled along an ancient route that goes through the country along the ridges and came to this area. What's special about Mount Gilboa is the stones that it's built upon. It's a kind of special limestone, and you'll notice this is a great example. It has lots and lots of holes in it, which means that it doesn't hold, the whole mountain doesn't hold a lot of water. The water just runs straight through and fills the valley below. That's one of the reasons the valley is fertile. And when it's properly inhabited, they take the water and they channel it for irrigation, and they control the flow so that any overflow in the rains runs out to the sea. But when it's not handled well, it becomes a swamp. And as a swampland, this valley becomes very uninhabitable. So when the Jewish people began to move back to the land of Israel at the turn of the 20th century, even a little before, one of the first things they did is they started to reroute all of this excess water and drain these swamps by channeling the water. And you can see some of these pools in which they're controlling the water flow now, so that this becomes a fertile land again. When Jewish people moved to this area, they purposely bought the swampland because no one was living there. And so they bought these big patches of swampland. They drained it by channeling the water out to the Mediterranean Sea, and that caused all of this land to become fertile again. And it was probably fertile during the time of Gideon, and as such, this was a breadbasket. But once the Midianites came, they probably didn't know how to take care of it, and so for those many years in which they were in control, probably the land became less and less hospitable. Because the nomadic tribes, even in modern times and in ancient times, they didn't appreciate farming. They wouldn't farm. It's even forbidden for them to throw seeds. And so for them to maintain the water channel systems or plant crops was anathema in their culture. It's something that they wouldn't have done. And as a result, most likely they would just eat whatever grew up year after year after year, and not planting wheat and other produce in the fields, which is why then they wanted the wheat and produce from the fields that the Israelites were growing, because after a few years of not maintaining this rich area, they needed to feed their animals from other sources. So we're still on Mount Gilboa. In this direction is the Jezreel Valley. And now we're looking at the hills of Judea and Samaria. Now, this was called Samaria in the time of Jesus. And this is, if you can see through the mist, and it's usually a little hazy here, except for 2 months out of the year, this is where Gideon had to travel to in order to get to Mount Gilboa. And you can see he traveled along the mountain ridges, and there are valleys over here as well. The cities or villages that you see in the distance are part of today, modern day, the Palestinian Authority. So we're looking at the Palestinian Authority from this hilltop. They named this hilltop Mount Barkan, and it used to have, and it still does have, a lot of vineyards on this mountain. Private vineyards, and we even have a winery called Barkan Winery, which is named after this hilltop because this is where they started their vineyards.
Judges chapter 6. Then the sons of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord gave them into the hands of Midian 7 years. The power of Midian prevailed against Israel. Because of Midian, the sons of Israel made for themselves the dens which were in the mountains, and the caves and the strongholds. For it was when Israel had sown that the Midianites would come up with the Amalekites and the sons of the east and go against them. So they would camp against them and destroy the produce of the earth as far as Gaza, and leave no sustenance in Israel, as well as no sheep, ox, or donkey. For they would come up with their livestock and their tents. They would come in like locusts for number. Both they and their camels were innumerable, and they came into the land to devastate it. So Israel was brought very low because of Midian, and the sons of Israel cried to the Lord. Now it came about, when the sons of Israel cried to the Lord on account of Midian, that the Lord sent a prophet to the sons of Israel, and he said to them, Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, It was I who brought you up from Egypt and brought you out of the house of slavery. I delivered you from the hands of the Egyptians and from the hands of all your oppressors, and dispossessed them before you, and gave you their land. And I said to you, I am the Lord your God. You shall not fear the gods of the Amorites in whose land you live, but you have not obeyed me. Then the angel of the Lord came and sat under the oak that was at Ophrah, and which belonged to Joash, the Abizarite, and his son Gideon was beating out wheat in the winepress in order to save it from the Midianites. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, The Lord is with you, O valiant warrior. Then Gideon said to him, O my Lord, if the Lord is with us, why then has all this happened to us? And where are all his miracles which our fathers told us about, saying, Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian. The Lord looked at him and said, Go in this your strength and deliver Israel from the hand of Midian. Have I not sent you? And he said to him, O Lord, how shall I deliver Israel? Behold, my family is the least of Manasseh, and I am the youngest in my father's house. But the Lord said to him, Surely I will be with you, and you shall defeat Midian as one man.
So here on Mount Barkan, we found an ancient wine press. Now it's very difficult to date a rock that's been carved. We don't know if this was here in the time of Gideon or just a couple hundred years ago, but the fact that a wine press is found here tells us that this was a winery. This was wine country. They put the wine presses in the vineyard in ancient times because there was always a risk if you try to transport all these grapes, they would get crushed, they would get bounced, they would get ruined on the way, and you'd lose some. So why bother to ruin any if you can just crush the grapes right here in the wine press? And they would crush the grapes by stomping their feet in this area, and the juice would run down into this vat. Now, why would Gideon be threshing wheat on a flat surface like this? Well, in general, this is a good place to thresh wheat. But what it means is that he had to harvest that wheat somewhere where there was a field, and then bring all that wheat here instead of threshing it where he should have threshed it, which was on the farm, which is what they would have done as well. And the threshing area of a wine press is very small. It's a lot of work. Whereas the threshing floor in a farm on farmland would have been much wider, broader, easier, and they would just pick it up and let the chaff fly away. Here it's great because the wind would blow and it would blow the chaff away very easily, but it means that they were doing a lot of extra work because they were afraid of the Midianites taking their food. And that shows you the conflict that we were dealing with. As we read in the scriptures, the Midianites would come and they would inhabit this land as soon as they sowed the wheat. Why? Because as soon as those little green shoots of produce comes up from the ground, their sheep and goats and even camels will start eating it. I think it's important to note that it says that their camels were innumerable. You know, if you are in charge of a flock of sheep, you also have camels, but you don't have a flock of camels. So you have a few camels for every flock of sheep, maybe one, two, three, whatever it might be. But if the camels were innumerable, it means that the sheep were beyond even contemplating how to categorize it. That's what they're talking about. So this plain beneath us was just completely covered with sheep and goats, just devouring the land like locusts. That's the picture the Bible gives us of the conflict. And it shows us how they were hiding every bit of food they could from the Midianites.
There were five, and one just flew out, and two more came in.
In chapter 7 of the book of Judges, we read, Then Yerubbabel, that is Gideon, and all the people who were with him arose early and camped beside the spring of Harod. And that's where we are right now. This is the spring of Harod. You can see the water bubbling out of the spring right now, and it's coming down. And in modern times, we've harnessed the waters of this spring and turned it into a nice recreational area. But in ancient times, this was a place to get water. And remember, we talked about how the mountain of Gilboa has very porous limestone and that water comes out in the valley. Well, this is the base of Mount Gilboa, and this is the water coming from Mount Gilboa and bubbling out into the valley here. And so when Gideon took his army here, he needed to take them someplace to get water before the attack, because you don't want to attack an enemy army unless you've refilled your water jugs. You don't know how long the battles will take, how many days or even weeks. You might have to chase after someone. You need to make sure you have enough water for your animals and for your men so that you're replenished. So this spring was really important in those days. And let's keep reading here the story. And he brought the people down to the water, and the Lord said to Gideon, this is in verse 5, You shall separate everyone who laps the water with his tongue, as a dog laps, as well as everyone who kneels to drink. Now the number of those who lapped, putting their hand on their mouth, was 300 men, but all the rest of the people kneeled to drink. And the Lord said to Gideon, I will deliver you with the 300 men who lapped, and I will give the Midianites into your hands, so that all the people go, each man to his own home. So the 300 men took the people's provisions and their trumpets into their hands, and Gideon sent all the other men, each to his own tent, but retained the 300 men, and the camp of Midian was below him in the valley. Moving on to chapter 7, verse 16, he says, He divided the 300 men into three companies, and he put trumpets and pitchers into the hands of all of them, with torches inside the pitchers. And he said, Look at me, and do likewise. And behold, when I come to the outskirts of the camp, do as I do. And when I and all who are with me blow the trumpet, then you shall also blow the trumpets all around the camp, and say, For the Lord and for Gideon. So I want you to imagine, like Jonathan is here, he's got a torch in one hand and a trumpet in the other hand. Guess what he doesn't have in either of his hands? A sword. They have no swords. They have only a trumpet and a torch. They took the jar, the clay jar, off of the torch so that the light shined, They broke it to wake up all the sleeping Midianites. And then the Midianites saw they were surrounded by what they thought was a massive army, and they ran. They ran in every direction. Now we have a mix of different tribes and different clans, and there were some Amalekites mixed in, and they started running each direction, and they thought they were under attack, so they started attacking those who were there. They started attacking each other. And Midian, with his 300 men, at first, they didn't even need to raise their swords, and they couldn't. Their hands were busy. One hand with a torch, and one hand with a trumpet in it.
So what do we learn from this? Well, there's a few lessons to be learned. I think starting with the last point is that Gideon and his soldiers learned to trust in the Lord and not in the sword. And in order to defeat the Midianites, they had to trust God for his provision, which he provided. We also learn that the conflict between the Midianites and the tribes of Israel was rooted in a drought in the land of Midian, which drove the Midianites to the north, fighting over the resources of food. We learn how important it was in ancient times to have these resources of water in a battle and in conflict between nations. It reminds me of the story of the Crusaders, who also fought a battle near here and lost because they couldn't get to the spring in order to rehydrate themselves and their animals, especially their war horses. It's also worth mentioning another famous battle called Ain Jalut between the Mamluks and the Mongols happened here. I believe the Mamluks used this same spring as a base of operation before the attack, which was significant in the annals of history because it was the only battle in which the Mongols ever lost. What I really love about this story of Gideon is how he trusted in the Lord to such a degree that he went into battle without even holding a sword in his hand. And it reminds me how we as believers are supposed to live, trusting in the Lord for every single provision, and how so often we desire to win the battle for the Lord when the Lord wants to win the battle for us. How so often we want to solve the problem ourselves and the Lord wants to solve the problem for us. How so often we want to trust in ourselves and in our own abilities, and the Lord so often is more than capable of doing so much without us and doing it so much better. And it reminds me how we need to be more attuned to his desire and his will and to trust in him in everything that we do, especially in the hard times or the difficult times, in the famines and in the plagues and in the wars. And all of these difficult periods of time that we go through, we must be like Gideon and go ready to battle with the most important weapon, our faith. If you'd like to learn more about us and our ministry, you can go to the Chosen People Ministries website and learn more about us. We are in full-time ministry, so certainly appreciate any support you can send our way, especially the support that means the most, your prayers. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you the next time on Tour with the Roses.